Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 125, Henry VI, Part 1, My Thoughts Are Whirled Like a Potter's Wheel. Last time, I concluded the Shakespeare biography, and so we finally get to talk in detail about the plays. I'm going to tackle them in chronological order, as far as that is possible to define, that is. And once we're a few plays in, I'll be introducing the life and plays of Ben Jonson into the story, so that the chronology is maintained as closely as possible across both playwrights. Particularly with Shakespeare, and particularly with the very early plays and the very late plays, we have to look at the question of co-authorship, and who those contributing authors might have been. So I'll also try to be explicit about that in each episode. Obviously, in the space of a roughly 30-minute podcast, I'm not going to be able to cover every nuance of the themes of a particular play or suggest explanation or context for every obscure reference. Inevitably, I'll be picking and choosing what I find most interesting and self-editing, without comment, a lot, to create an episode. But, at the very least, I hope I will be able to show you why the play is worth our attention, what it was trying to say in the context of its time, and, most of all, why you should go and see it being performed. Where there are alternative views on and multiple interpretations of the plays, I'll try to put these forward, and in the course of this, I'm pretty sure that I'm going to say things that you, from time to time, will disagree with. I'll be happy to hear from you on those matters, and will do my best to feed alternative commentary back into the podcast, where it adds to the overall picture. So, and this all feels a little daunting, but with a deep breath, here goes. Henry VI Part 1 is a particularly problematic play when it comes to dating its creation. The first evidence we have is from Henslow's diary, where he noted that the play Harry VI, that's spelt Harey, was performed at the Rose Theatre on the 3rd of March 1592. Henslow also marked this entry NE, which is generally accepted to mean a first performance, or at least a first performance at one of Henslow's theatres. However, as you know by now, nothing is ever that simple in the world of early modern theatre. Nowhere does the entry mention that this is the Shakespeare play. No author is cited, which was quite normal for the time. And the NE could mean not that it was new, but that it was performed at the Newington Butts Theatre rather than at the Rose. The Harry for Henry was a common form at the time, so no one has a problem with this being a Henry VI history play. And there are some other indications that it is the Shakespeare version. If it is, then this is the first mention of a Shakespeare play in Henslow's diary. He was not the most methodical record keeper, but he did consistently identify sequels in his records. So it's safe to say that this is not Henry VI Part 2 or 3. Those two plays were first published in 1594 and 1595. We also see from Henslow's records that the play was a success. He records 15 performances in total, and the first performance took £3, 16 shillings and 8 pence. That is the best daily box office takings recorded in the diary to that point, and some of the highest takings in the period covered by the diary in total. This is significant in supporting some other evidence. In his 1592 book Piers Penniless' Supplication to the Devil, Thomas Nash describes how very popular a history play featuring the exploits of Lord Talbot in France was, saying, "How would it have joyed brave Talbot, the terror of the French, to think that after he had lain 200 years in his tomb, he should triumph again on the stage, and have his bones new embalmed with the tears of 10,000 spectators at least at several times, who, in the tragedian that represents his person, imagine they behold him fresh bleeding." Lord Talbot features heavily in the play, and Nash's book is dedicated to Lord Strange, whose men performed Henry VI at Henslow's Theatre, which seems just a little too cosy to be a coincidence. The idea that 10,000 attended sounds like hyperbole, but no doubt suggests a very popular play. But in some interpretations, the takings at the theatre support this number, while others suggest perhaps double that. Nash praises the performance of the actor playing Talbot, the tragedian that represents his person. That was probably Edward Allen, the leading man in Lord Strange's company. And as you're about to hear, Nash quite probably had his own reasons for basking in the success of the play. So, the general consensus is that this is the Shakespeare version of Henry VI, because the only other alternative would be to accept that there was another very popular version out at about the same time that is now entirely lost, apart from this mention, all of which seems very unlikely. However, there are a few further complications. Some of this confusion arises because of the way the three plays about the reign of Henry VI are titled in printed editions. The first folio has the three plays we are familiar with as the first, second and third parts of the trilogy. With Richard III, they form a tetralogy of plays telling Shakespeare's version of the War of the Roses. So by 1623, when the first folio was collated and printed, things were settled. But in 1594, there was a printed quarto edition titled The First Part of the Contention Betwixt the Two Famous Houses of York and Lancaster. This is a version of what we now know as Henry VI Part 2. The following year, what we know as Part 3 was published in a version called The True Tragedy of Richard, Duke of York, and the Death of Good King Henry VI, with the whole contention between the two houses Lancaster and York. These plays don't mention the events that happen in Part 1, and there is no evidence of a printed edition of Part 1 prior to the inclusion of the play in the first folio. What we can be sure of is that Part 3 was well known by 1592 because of the Robert Greene reference to the Tiger's Heart line. Yet Henslow seemingly described Part 1 as new. This whole situation is very confusing, and greater minds than mine have ruminated over it for years without firm conclusions. But the general consensus is that Part 2 was probably written first, with Part 3 following soon after on the heels of its success. And Part 1 is a prequel filling in the backstory. If this is correct, then the plays were just renamed in the first folio to give them chronological coherence. This view is supported by the fact that Part 1 does seem detached from Parts 2 and 3, which were very clearly written as a pair. And there is an interesting theory which, if correct, points to the influence that the changes in the playing companies could have made. The suggestion is that Lord Strange's men playing at the Rose saw the success of Shakespeare's two-part play and decided to have their own prequel written to jump into the zeitgeist. Further down the line, with the reconfiguration of the troops, Shakespeare's company acquired the play, and the three plays could now be performed as a trilogy, at which point Shakespeare had a go at polishing up the original version of Part 1. I should reiterate that this is a theory without any firm proof, but I do find it a beguiling idea. So in one way or another, we have Shakespeare's first part of Henry VI. Except, do we? How much Shakespeare is really in this play? As you already know, collaboration in the writing of plays was very common, and for a long time, different styles have been detected in this play, suggesting several hands were at work on it. But it was included in the first folio, so Hemmings and Condell were happy to put Shakespeare's name on it. Edward Malone suggested in his 1790 edition of the plays that because of the many classical references in the play, it was likely that sections were written by Robert Greene, George Peele, or Thomas Nash. This view was doubted in later scholarship, with the academic community being very divided on the question, some, notably Eustace Tilliard in the 1940s, believing that the play was entirely Shakespeare, while others thought that he had virtually no input to it at all. Modern textual analysis has also not really helped with the question. A major study in 1995 suggested that only 19% of the play was written by Shakespeare, with all of Act 1 being given to Thomas Nash. A 2016 study by Oxford University Press concluded that all three Henry VI plays were co-written with Christopher Marlowe, and in editions of Part 1 published by them since then, the play is credited as by Thomas Nash, Christopher Marlowe and Anonymous, adapted by William Shakespeare. Other study based on textual analysis has suggested that Thomas Kidd was Nash's co-author. It remains a complex discussion, and one I'll leave here for the moment, as next time we will be hearing about textual analysis and how other early modern playwrights influenced Shakespeare, so hold on to those thoughts. The sources for the play are a 1548 work by Edward Hall called The Union of the Two Noble and Illustrious Families of Lancaster and York, and Holinshed's Chronicles, first published in 1577 with a second edition in 1587. Holinshed based the Wars of the Roses section of his history on Hall's earlier work. Some sections are copied verbatim. But there is enough original work, unique to both publications, to suggest that Shakespeare had access to and used both of them. As I mentioned in my introduction to the season, I'm not going to give a detailed synopsis of every play, and in this case I will just briefly outline the plot and the context. The play opens with the funeral of Henry V, the great English hero who fought and won against the French to claim lands that England thought rightfully theirs through historic rights. Whatever we think of the play as a whole, I do find this a powerful opening scene, tapping into the national sentiment that the legend of Henry V still must have held over people. From later years, we have comments about the grandeur that was attempted on this sort of set-piece scene, particularly with the use of extravagant costumes. As this is relatively early in the period, Henslow's costume store may not have been as well stocked as it undoubtedly became, but I can't help feeling that this was an incredibly strong visual opening. The stage direction reads, Dead March. Enter the funeral of King Henry V, attended by the Dukes of Bedford, Regent of France, Gloucester, Protector, and Essex, Earl of Warwick, the Bishop of Winchester, heralds, and co. And then Bedford says, Hung be the heavens with black, yield day to night. Comets importing change of times and states, brandish your crystal tresses in the sky, and with them scourge the bad revolting stars that have contested unto Henry's death. King Henry V, too famous to live long, England ne'er lost a king of so much worth. And Gloucester continues, England ne'er had a king until his time, virtue he had, deserving to command. His brandished sword did blind men with his beams, his arms spread wider than a dragon's wings, his sparkling eyes, replete with wrathful fire, more dazed and drove back his enemies than midday sun fierce bent against their faces. What should I say? His deeds exceed all speech. He ne'er lifted up a hand but conquered. Other lords add their thoughts in the same vein, but you get the idea. The reign of Henry V was England's greatest time, and, in contrast to the French, the English sense of their history and therefore their rights has a firm base in that period. Perhaps these lines are Thomas Nash's creation and not Shakespeare's, but I think admirable nonetheless. But the moment is lost when bad news comes by messenger that the French are in revolt. The English lands are under threat and Lord Talbot, the leading English knight, has been captured. The French are being aided by Joan la Pucelle, Joan the Maid, who, of course, we now know as Joan of Arc. Talbot is used in a prisoner exchange and rejoins his army, leading them to victory despite Joan's rallying of the French army and her skills as a witch. Talbot and the English army triumph at Rouen and Orléans. Back in England, at the court where the young king is weak, the lords are restless. An argument breaks out between the Dukes of York and Somerset. Factions build around the two, and as mark of their allegiance, the lords pluck a white or a red rose from a bush to wear about their person. York meets his uncle, Mortimer, who is being held at the Tower of London, and is told how Richard's father was in line for the throne before he was killed. Richard swears to regain his birthright. Problems build for the English as their ally Burgundy is persuaded by Joan to defect to the French side, and Henry's pleas to York and Somerset to resolve their differences go unheeded. The York and Somerset rivalry spills over into the war when the dukes fail to provide men and supplies for Talbot, blaming each other for the failure. At Bordeaux, the battle is lost, and Talbot and his son are killed. Richard, Duke of York, takes his place as commander in France, but the English position looks perilous until the Pope sends a plea for peace on both sides, and Joan is captured. Richard orders her burnt at the stake. The English and the French sides reach an uneasy peace by agreeing to marry Henry to a woman of the French nobility. But the French king makes it clear that he will break this truce at the first opportunity, and duplicity and self-interest on the English side rears its head again when the Earl of Suffolk falls in love with his captive, the French noblewoman Margaret of Anjou. In order to keep her close and to increase his power with the king, he persuades Henry to marry her. His lines close the play. Margaret will now be queen and rule the king, but I will rule both her, the king, and the realm. The prequel clearly then tries to link itself to the subsequent parts. With this ending, surely the audiences would expect parts 2 and 3 to be played very soon. This is, of course, part of the version in the first folio, so further speculation is possible that this is a heavily adapted version of an original play, rewritten in parts to make it clear that it is the first part of the trilogy. Whatever the case, it's a great cliffhanger ending to the play that is otherwise very problematic to modern eyes. But what about the audience of the time? I've already mentioned that this was a popular piece in its day, and it's maybe not too difficult to see why that was. The 1590s were a time when the popularity of history plays in general really took off, and this may be thanks in part, at least, to the Henry VI plays. Previous history plays had tended to deal with characters from the deeper past who had mythical status. Tamburlaine springs easily to mind, but there was also Green and Lodge's Turkish play Selimus and an anonymous Edmund Ironside and others. Henry VI is probably the first time that a history play was lifted out of that mythical sphere and given as a retelling of historical fact, notwithstanding that the historical facts of this period are twisted to an English perspective in this play. It is also suggested that with the growing confidence of England after the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, it was easier for playwrights to deal with more recent English history. Although nearly 200 years old, this history does in the end lead to the Tudor dynasty. Many critics have found the play problematic because of its tone, which is very jingoistic, with the French shown as less than worthy opponents who rely on a witch for their success. Unlike the English, they are shown as lacking a history of their own. All their references are to foreign lands and potentates, which only adds to the idea that there is something inherently untrustworthy and exotic in their nature. The fact that there are several battles, perhaps I should say skirmishes, depicted in the play has also given rise to criticism. The view that showing a battle on stage rather than having it reported was a weakness held sway for a long time, and for some this shows an inability of the dramatist to handle his sources well. It's undeniable that later Shakespeare plays handle battle scenes with much more subtle and nuanced ways, and the question remains whether the main problem with the play is the inexperience of the playwright, the unsatisfying effect of the collaboration, or the immaturity of the history play as a form, or perhaps it's some combination of these and other factors. But for all these criticisms, the play does retain some complexities. The English are not simply shown as the good guys. The treachery of Somerset and York to Talbot, and therefore to their king, is not shied away from. The plucking of the red and white roses is a completely non-historical scene, but a great theatrical moment, especially as the Tudors, the current ruling dynasty, had successfully detached themselves from these events, and liked to be seen as the inheritors of a better way of ruling, however much this was the first part of their own story. The opening scene, where the dead Henry V is praised for his bravery and leadership, still would have resonated with the audiences. Although set in 1422, some 170 years ago, the memory of Henry V was still prominent in the public imagination. A great warrior king who died for his country and was buried in Westminster Abbey. His particular story had been plundered by others, and Shakespeare would, of course, make his own highly successful version. But here, the contrast is with his weak son, thanks to his age, and the restless courtiers. It is an intentionally sombre start, because at its heart, this play is dealing with the loss of England's empire and the death of a chivalric way of life. Contrast Talbot, the ultimate loyal knight, with the scheming of Somerset, York, and their companions. Talbot has a lengthy death scene following his call for support from the army, which does not appear thanks to the aristocratic factions back in England. And the pathos is doubled when his son joins him in death rather than fleeing the battlefield. The end of the line of chivalry indeed. His antithesis is the character Fastolf, the cowardly braggart soldier for whom self-preservation is the top priority. This character has a very small part in the play, but we cannot think of him as anything than a proto-Falstaff. Talbot's scene in Act 4, Scene 1, as he calls Fastolf out in front of the king, is, I think, one of the best passages in the play, and a lament for the death of the chivalric code. I vowed, base knight, when I did meet thee next, to tear the garter from thy craven's leg, which I have done because unworthily thou wert installed in that high degree. Pardon me, princely Henry and the rest, this dastard at the battle of Patey, where but in all I was 6,000 strong, and that the French were almost 10 to 1, before we met, or that a stroke was given, like to a trusty squire did run away. In which assault we lost 1,200 men, myself and divers gentlemen besides, were there surprised and taken prisoners. Then judge, great lords, if I have done amiss, or whether such cowards ought to wear this ornament of knighthood, yea or no. When first this order was ordained, my lords, knights of the Garter were of noble birth, valiant and virtuous, full of haughty courage, such as was grown to credit by the wars, not fearing death nor shrinking for distress, but always resolute in most extremes. He then, that is not furnished of that sort, doth but usurp the sacred name of knight, profaning this most honourable order, and should, if I were worthy to be judge, be quite degraded like a hedge-born swain that doth presume to boast of gentle blood. The intention is for us to see Talbot as the last true representative of the ideal contained in the memory of Henry V. With both Henry and Talbot dead, the ideal of chivalry is also dead, to be replaced by the politicking and selfishness of the English elite, something that leads directly to the Wars of the Roses and the decline of power in England until the rise of the Tudors. This is the message of the play, maybe not stated explicitly but manifest nonetheless. And Talbot's exploits from nearly 200 years ago probably had resonance for the contemporary audience. In the summer of 1591, the Earl of Essex landed in Dieppe at the head of a small army and fought their way to Rouen, very much in the footsteps of Talbot, it could be said. Indeed, the Earl's youngest brother was killed at the walls of the city. Although Essex and his men pressed on beyond Rouen, the oncoming winter only brought retreat and a less than glorious return to England. Perhaps this play, which undoubtedly relishes in Talbot's heroism, was one way to try and blot out these more recent events. Talbot can also be seen as a prototype for the later Shakespeare version of Henry V, a hotspur for those like the Earl of Essex who looked back to the times of chivalry and whose worldview was perhaps more black and white than many in the court, who were becoming versed in more subtle political ways of achieving their ends. Opposing Talbot are the effeminate, duplicitous French and their tame witch Joan, who presents the audience, who, let's face it, were probably already biased against her to a man, with a different question. Is she saint or is she devil? The expressed view of the English is that she is nothing but a witch and a whore, but when we see her, she is an odd combination of naive young girl and clever warrior. She can outthink the French knights with strategies against the English, but never sees that she might be being manipulated by the king and the Dauphin. Charles, the Dauphin, has to operate in her shadow, having lost to her in single combat and handed command of the army to her, something that is quite obviously a dent in his military prowess. But the French accept her claim to be God's chaste messenger, and she appears to prove her point through victory on the battlefield. Once captured and facing death, she tries to avoid her fate by pretending pregnancy. The dramatist's position seems clear here. This is not the behaviour of a true saint who would have gone stoically to her fate. No surprise that there is no love for the French Catholic Joan. Apart from Joan, the only female characters in the play are the Countess of Auvergne and Margaret of Anjou. Margaret plays a larger role in the plot as Suffolk falls for her charms. She appears in the later plays as a very strong and significant character, quite a different character from the one that we see here. In Part 3, she becomes called the She-Wolf of the French. Her presence certainly adds to the idea that this play is an intentional prequel to the subsequent plays. Talbot does not only face opposition from the French, but from some of the English lords. Where the bickering of Somerset and York has direct practical consequences on Talbot's campaign and ultimately drives England to something close to civil war, the early part of the play is more concerned with the older rivalries between the elder statesman Gloucester, protector of England and ruling in the name of the king, and the Bishop of Winchester, who is also a cardinal. They encourage their supporters to fight in the streets, fights that continue as they make up part of the army in France. The message about the dangers of aristocratic rivalries and by extension the danger of civil war is clear. The French owed their victories to the disunity of the English. The sacrifice of Talbot and his son cannot outweigh the self-interest of ambition that plagues the English. The fact that the play is called Henry VI seems something of a misnomer, given the small part the young king plays in the whole piece. Perhaps the title was there just to make it clear that this was the prequel to the other two parts. The History of Brave Talbot might have been a more appropriate title. Talbot is the nearest thing to a central character, but he doesn't centre the play like Henry V or Richard III do, and the characters of Henry and the other major lords don't linger in the memory like John of Gaunt does in the Henry IV plays. That is a problem for the play in a structural sense, but does give space for the ineffective yet good intentions of Henry to be seen. Divine guidance seems to be missing here, and the Elizabethan fear of a weak king is palpable. A persistent criticism of the play has been its episodic nature. It's true that scenes follow a chronology of time rather than being crafted with juxtaposition in mind, but this was the nature of the Elizabethan history play, a form of which Shakespeare soon broke the structures, but here we have a play that follows Holinshed and the other sources quite strictly. Perhaps it's a sign of a young playwright struggling to find his own voice. Perhaps multiple authorship has contributed to the episodic feel of the piece, but we might just see this as a dramatic device that works to stress the gap between the chivalric old guard and the self-interested younger generation. The play also defies the Aristotelian unities, something that Philip Sidney was criticising English theatre for as early as 1595, which also fed into distaste for the play in the 18th century, when the vogue for neoclassical rules reigned supreme. This is where Samuel Johnson leapt to Shakespeare's defence, questioning not only if Shakespeare was even aware of these rules, but questioning their very validity. As he put it, "To the unities of time and place he has shown no regard, and perhaps a nearer view of the principles on which they stand will diminish their value, and withdraw them from the veneration which, from the time of Cornell, they have been very generally received, by discovering that they have given more trouble to the poet than pleasure to the auditor." The later history of performances of the first part of Henry VI is, to say the least, sketchy. Despite its initial popularity, it was not taken up after the Restoration in the way that other Shakespeare plays were. Indeed, only one performance is recorded through the 18th century. The general view was that it was a poor quality work, perhaps not even authored by Shakespeare. In his essay on the dramatic character of John Falstaff, published in 1777, Maurice Morgan described it as a drum and trumpet thing, furbished up with here and there a little sentiment and diction. That view more or less persisted through the next century. Samuel Taylor Coleridge thought that one only had to read the opening speech to feel the impossibility of it having been written by Shakespeare. And perhaps, despite my liking for it, he was right about that passage. But as a whole, we should take this play on its own merits. Let's not dislike it just because we think it's poor Shakespeare or too much Nash, but look at it as a collaboration and a piece of its time. So, my first foray into Shakespeare plays raises more questions than answers, which I hope is not too dissatisfying. But this is the reality of studying early modern theatre. It is very rare to see the play performed these days. You might see it in a truncated form or as part of the trilogy in a conjoined version. For the full version of the play, and it is an almost uncut version, the BBC adaptation from 1981 is available on DVD. It's this version that I watched to refresh my memory. It is presented in an artificial style with a very low budget look to it, perhaps looking to be something close to a mid-sized company stage production. I thought it stood up very well despite its age. You will also see parts of the play as part of The Hollow Crown, an admirable work that joins all three Henry VI plays together that was originally presented by the RSC, again adapted by the BBC in 2016. Although not a full version of the plays, this is well worth a watch, with much higher production values than the 1981 version. Next time we continue with the second part of Henry VI, as we see what the early stages of the Wars of the Roses looked like given the Shakespearean treatment. In the meantime, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or X just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. New episodes there are continuing the story of criticism of Shakespeare through the centuries, but you also get immediate access to all the back episodes too. If you can spare a few moments, I would be very grateful if you could review the podcast on your app of choice. This would really help other people to find the podcast. You can find details of this and ways to support the podcast at the website, which is www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or via X at thoetp.